Hello everyone, today we talk about the second invasions and more like in a sort of consideration on the historiographical approach and the idea of it in popular culture. If I talk about the second invasions, most people, I guess, even just by definition, this is at least how I came to learn them, to name them, say, in my studies, do not really figure out what this concretely is, nor at least know exactly what is the, let's say, even the list of peoples we're talking about completely. Most people just address this phenomenon as the Viking era, per se, so they narrow it down essentially to the Scandinavians, and neglect, so mostly from a Northern European perspective, that is essentially Anglo-centric in a way, and it's fine. Again, for England, that was really the Viking era, all right? Not just because they didn't see, I don't know, Saracens or Magyars, but in the British Isles, but because indeed the impact of the Vikings, not just among the Anglo-Saxons, but because the broader British world is, it was really substantial and brought to some changes really deep and important, and it's fine. But because of the preeminence of Anglo-Saxon culture in the West, and again, it's absolutely fine and absolutely natural, popular culture everywhere kind of has interiorized in the Western world and beyond. This is just, there was a Viking era in the first place, and other theaters are not just the Magyars or the Saracens, but we're talking even in general about other populations, such as the same Slavs, or the Bulgars, or Turkic peoples that came at different waves from the Eurasian steppes to torment the continent, have been kind of reduced to, that doesn't count, and it doesn't count much in the broader comprehensive reading of the world, because these things were not separated, right? This is a prejudice, let's say, mostly rooted in the idea of the Middle Ages that we have matured, so that by, let's say, what we call the migration era, in a narrow Western European sense, is like the late antiquity, part of the early Middle Ages, and we see this more like a comprehensive stuff. Accomplice of which is the equation, even in there, as a bit forced, with the Germanic character of those migrations that indeed were the most important in Europe, but that were going on like together with lots of other things and the movements of other peoples that also caused it to them. The Huns a bit remained so central in European history and tradition and idea, at the point of being overrated actually, that yes, we see the Huns, but it's not just the Huns, and it's not just about Europe, it's also about the empire in itself. That is, at the end of the day, a European empire over other areas like in the Near East and North Africa, where you see changes that would have also triggered quite important ones later on, such as the Islamic conquests, for example, that were going on in ways that, by the way, were dramatically similar to also what was happening in a more narrowly Germanic sense. For example, as a military historian and as a great fan of equestrian culture in general, mounted warfare during the migration era is something strikingly, if not embarrassingly similar, all over this world. Right, you can't properly say there was a single people out there basically didn't make use of cavalry on a regular basis as the central symbol of its warlike ethos at the time. You see it from the Moors to the Persians, from the Celts, even to the Slavs. I mean, to peoples, even the same. I mean, let's pick, for example, the Anglo-Saxons or the Norse. At the time, didn't have a dramatic equestrian development. This is notorious, right? But still, the importance of it was central, and this is often overlooked. Even the Arabs, There's yet another people that was mostly famous for infantry, not much of a cavalry development, actually had an enormous emphasis placed on cavalry as it came to develop, also by imitation of the Sasanians, of the same Romans at the end of the day. So here, in this video, you understand I'm already putting a lot of stuff on the table, because it's really about the broader picture that can make you realize how fixating on certain kind of smaller aspects can lead you astray in a very important by a very important degree. The second invasions altogether are part of a history that, of course, is being built from a Latin-Germanic perspective. Like, if you study as a continental European like me, if you go to university, you study these things, but also since school, frankly, the idea is that Normans, Saracens, and Magyars attacked kind of all together. They're studied all together, right? We don't fixate just on one of the three. Also because basically almost all of our countries were struck by all three of these peoples. I mean, in post-Carolingian Europe, that we are factually what we're talking about here, both West Francia and East Francia and the Italic Kingdom were attacked by all three of these peoples, both by the Vikings, the Saracens, and the Magyars. Yes, the Saracens through the Alps, crossed and reached even the Rhineland, right? So it was really an important moment of, as you understand, also of crisis, of difficulty. The 10th century especially is remembered as the Iron Century, as one of kind of second dark age in perspective. And I made a couple of videos on the second invasions, and we have talked also a bit more individually about the Vikings, the Saracens, and the Magyars, and they all have their story and their ways that they've been told, which kind of could be told much better. We made a meme out of them, right? Especially out of the Vikings that are some of the peoples that have been more disgustingly misportrayed, for better or for worse, in the history of historiography, in fact. Whereas, the Saracens, the Magyars, you see, you never hear like there was a Saracen era, right? And you immediately understand what's the bias there, right? Because we say, well, at least the Vikings were Europeans, right? They actually were part of what would become the West, the Christian world, etc. Whereas the Saracens, no. Who does like them? They were just Muslims from Africa, from Arabia. We don't wanna even think there was a thing like the Saracen era, right? Words are important historiographically, but aside from the fact that many Saracens were actually Spanish, Italians, or Greeks, and more, the actual picture that is more interesting to draw is the conjunction, let's say, of these first of all, the heterogeneity of these movements, it should be said, within themselves too, because the term Saracen especially is also one of the grossest approximations that you can imagine. That the term actually comes from the Sarkenoi, that were a tribe in the Sinai Peninsula that were these Arab they were auxiliaries also in Roman times. As a synecdoche, they came to define those Semitic populations that actually, with some of even the Saracens, strictly speaking, later on have, again, nothing to do. But there is a big difference between, an Iberian pirate and, an Abbasid Caliphate guard, right? We're talking about completely different people's ideas. There was a kind of a unifying factor, maybe in religion, but sometimes not even. As we were saying before, actually many Saracens were even Christian. But these are the stories that you're not told, because again, the entire attention has been shifted towards this or that people in ways that really do not correspond to a scientific criterion. The Magyars too have been, there is a lot going on, of course, with also modern identities making in countries where, that have always been tormented in terms of national history, resurgence, dominations, ethnicities, and so that gets into the intrication mostly of the narrative that has been a bit even too much constrained. In fact, in the historiographies of, not necessarily speaking of Hungary itself, but let's say in general how we have come to define them, that in Europe there is a divide between, let's say, what we think of West and East. That also is probably the single most overlooked aspect especially in the current, political assessment of Europe, that has been, even in there, kind of silenced for specific political reasons, both on the left and on the right, that do not want to stress the divide, and that, generally speaking, are, say, mostly driving towards kind of an ethno-racialistic approach to what we should consider modern identities like. That is to say, just if you're white, doesn't matter where you come from, it's okay, it's the same, there is no difference. We're actually witnessing exactly in the last months that this is absolutely not true on a cultural ground, and it's and great part of this, of course, derives from prejudices and etc., but also for a general lack of interest of the same Westerners towards the history, actually, of Central Europe rather than Eastern Europe or the Balkans, and these divides often are also overlooked. I remember when I started Schwerpunkt, I mostly used the Western-Eastern dichotomy. That is, I wouldn't differentiate much between, Central or Eastern Europe in some degree, right? I wouldn't give to it, bizarrely enough, because up to that point I had been interested also in the history of Central Europe per se, Mitteleuropa Europa per se, but it would still be kind of a somewhat Western, a softly Western biased perspective that I refined over time. And I don't digress further, because there are interesting things about Schwerpunkt in itself and what I do in here that is connected with that. But maybe we'll see it in the future. But let's be honest, even I see it from my audience. My audience is overwhelmingly Anglophone, properly from, not just because people speak English, of course, mostly I talk to Americans, British, Canadians, right? We're just mostly the audience. And I do realize that, it's not about them. Believe me, this is present also in, in continental Europe consistently. There is probably an ignorance from our side of what has been even just Central European history, not even Eastern Europe, the most distant, let's say. It's properly a part of our Western mythology, at least in the liberal progressistic way that has been forced down our throats, that has removed essentially the realization of what Europe was before the Enlightenment, before the intense modernity kicked in. With its pros and cons, by the way, because, as you know, I firmly believe there is also a divide. And so, we're talking about differences. Western is not Central, it's not Eastern, it's not, etc. Mostly today, the main dichotomy you find in popular culture is an ethno-racialistic one. That is to say, Europe is mostly divided between North and South, right? Against any, kind of even macroscopic evidence wealth distribution in most cases. And in fact, neglecting mostly the Eastern-Western differences and the deep heterogeneity also, frankly, of the Southern Europeans themselves, because there is this sort of Mediterraneanism, and that doesn't quite take in consideration that the northern shores of the Mediterranean were, it's not much that they developed earlier for identities on its own, but let's say they accumulated much more things individually on its own to make them much more different between each other than, say, Northern European nations. And this is especially obvious when you look at properly medieval history, right? And this other acknowledgement that I see is somewhat strange. Like most popular culture about the Middle Ages is based on a exasperated late medievalistic feudalistic mindset. It's about the knights in shining armor. It's basically the end of the Middle Ages. It's something that tends mostly to mix with the modernistic bias and all these things. And let's say the Middle Ages has been instrumentalized by national historiographies everywhere in Europe, like saying, that was the moment when we were, like, as an individual country, we were cool, that we had something that was kind of like the others, right? So all the complexes, all the all the differences that came to be ever overwhelmingly more evident in contemporary times. It's as if, that was the magic moment in which there's no difference, everything's fine, don't watch it. And now, what's happening here, we were cool with part of the same thing. That's what you see even among reenactment groups. What do people reenact the most? They reenact the migration era, because it was more or less, much more similar, grounded everywhere, and it makes some peoples also that not just were underdeveloped at the time, is still underdeveloped today, kind of, the protagonists of the story, and also based there on a very heavily biased ethno-racialism that is frankly disgusting, because this often happens in, especially in countries in, educational systems that have an appallingly low, if not properly non-existent literacy level, where properly history is not known. It's like, it's not even a fantasy. It properly doesn't exist in the cultural horizons. And especially in the post-socialist world, for obvious reason. But that medievalistic symbol becomes the graal, the mean of self-redemption and reward in the face of what, right? Of essential alienation from reality, right? So when we study medieval history, even the fact that we still call this period the Middle Age, as if it didn't even have a dignity on its own, just already tells you how much we are not at peace at all with ourselves, with our culture. And this is, of course, mostly the fault of the Fourth Estate. It's mostly the fault of the masses that have been brutally brought on the fore, without any qualitative worth, essentially, without any form of appreciable education of an actual quality scientific basis, that are brought to move, and they must be fed with some bullshit that has to make them not realize how low they still have remained, in spite of all modernity, of improvement, whatever, and how real life problems derive or actually are mirrored exactly by such completely, alienated, that's really the thing, from reality, visions of history that reflect essentially just how much you don't know anything about. So thinking medieval history is okay, we shouldn't talk about this today, but it's important to stress, because every time I make a video here, I realize that I have the responsibility to spread some kind of ideas that have to make sense in a way or another, but they have to be properly so, because they must have a positive impact on reality. Well, what do we study history for? Right, that's why most channels, and I don't want to be mistaken for one of them, act as bards of meme, kind of nationalistic, ethnicistic, flattened storytelling, right? Clickbaiting for the sake of saying, oh, look, it's the history of this people, which is your people, which is cool, click on it, watch it. No, I will not do that. First of all, because I think that most people, in general, everywhere in the world, are actually pretty disgusting, including, in the best countries in the world, and which are best in relative terms. It's not that they are, this much in absolute terms in the first place. And secondly, why would I talk history for otherwise? I mean, to convince. I know it would be profitable to exploit people's ignorance and frustrations and inferiority complexes and so on, but I tend to respect the dignity of human intelligence when I find it, and I, deep inside, if you wouldn't believe, I actually still believe every human being can prove to be intelligent by some decent standards. But the reason exactly why I do this is complementary to the fact that I don't see this much happening. And so I presume that telling the story for what it is and not flattering really anybody is, is the best service that I can render while talking about this stuff. So the second invasions, I plan even to create some playlists to properly picture this historical concept as such, because I feel them missing, as if they were a giant black hole of some of the single most important medieval history issues that historiographically have been so important. For example, I dedicate all this great relevance to the High Middle Ages, which are exactly, mostly I care about the continental perspective. You know that my interests overall are somewhat Holy Roman Imperial in nature. That's where my soft bias is. It's basically German history, Italian history, and some interesting part of also Western Slavic history, at least in relation to the same Holy Roman Empire. Not all, right? Talk about, as you know, many other things, many other peoples, and I should talk actually much more, especially of France, of Britain, of Spain. I've talked really too few. But let's say that, again, I care for creating a perspective. It's not just a niche, right, for, just getting the clicks from, those things that nobody really talks about, to be the one. Now these years, I don't think that somebody stole the idea or imitated me or anything, but let's say when I began to make videos, there was literally zero about the Merovingians. How can there be zero about the Merovingians in a platform like YouTube that is essentially just Western in nature? Like, what have we done to our own past to the point of probably not giving a freaking damn about that? There are all the reasons in the world. At this point I could easily even turn this video into, like, let's debunk and let's explain actually all the reasons of the myths that have been formed and why, right? It's just more interesting than even just debunking it, because it gives you the reason why that myth was formulated. But I'll try to stick to this aspect. It actually has to do with the relation. That's another topic that the most perceptive of you probably have been aware to this point. That is a bit of comparison of what is the Latin-Germanic Europe, Post-Carolingian Europe, let's say, and its institutions, and the Byzantine Empire as essentially the most important centers of power in the West, at least in there was also the Caliphate of Cordoba. It was quite a power to be reckoned with, but sticking to the Christian side, and given that the Muslims were from essentially the side that was actually making pressure on the same Christian system, so belonging in part to the same invasions in a way. But the picture we get today, let's say, the Islamic side is, as we were saying before, complex, because there were actual powers were acting as real states, and actually of Hellenistic Roman tradition in terms of centralization of permanent military. I mean, the Abbasid Caliphate, Fatimid Egypt, like the Caliphate of Cordoba. I mean, even Aghlabid Tunisia by a certain degree. I mean, those were states, right? They were something that the Normans, the Slavs, the Magyars didn't quite have, right? So the interactions were different, and it was not just the Saracens as pirates per se, even though they did that, and they are very interestingly comparable to the Scandinavians in a way. And interestingly enough, they were defeated, and the reason why they were defeated is not because they were much less insidious than the Scandinavians. It's that probably they met with something in Southern Europe that was somewhat, in fact, even they are more overrated and overlooked than the usual. Also, I made, again, multiple videos about the Saracens, and I explained this thing, that really most of these invasions in general, this is valid also for the Vikings, the Magyars, actually succeeded or even properly were put properly in motion, not by some kind of trigger in the homeland, but simply by the collapse of the giant of the Carolingian Empire. And that's pretty sensible when you look at not just that the Carolingians would throw Vikings at each other on a regular basis to consolidate their own power at the detriment of others. And so there you got it all. But this was actually the same story in, for example, in southern Italy and in a way in the same eastern Francia with the Magyars. Because let's be honest, at that point, Western Europe was more advanced than the rest, right? You know, just the Byzantines, the Caliphate of Cordoba was, but when we look at these invaders, especially from the north and the east, like there wasn't civilization there. It was something else, right? There were still tribes, semi-nomadism. There were no cities. It was a different thing. And thus, there is an obvious analogy between these peoples, and even just from their direction, sometimes they were the same peoples, really. I mean, with the former migration era, that again, in Western Europe, we have decided it ends at some point. When does the migration era end in Western Europe? Say with the Lombard invasions, right? With the Anglo-Saxons, like basically it, like at the second half of the 6th century, right? But if we just shift a little bit, not even much, just not much actually, east, or even if we take in consideration, especially Germany and Italy per se, we realize that these migrations didn't really stop at all. I mean, immediately east of these countries, there were I say it with all the most possible neutral way, the barbarians, literally. And these waves of, unstable peoples that frankly weren't there to create any stability, given that they were pushing west, right? Okay, in the early Middle Ages, of course, it was a brutal demographic and economical contraction. But I mean, we all know what's the phenomenon of Slavization, for example, in the same Byzantine Empire. I mean, these peoples were on the move and were kind of pressuring in. And then think about the Avars, and think about the Bulgars, and think about the Magyars. I mean, these were avalanches of peoples that came without arrest, right? Constantinople knew better at some point, also because they had the Arabs from the other side. But in this sense, we have also read Constantinople in a sort of pietistic way, I would say. Also, the Byzantine Empire has been turned into a meme, right? The only meme, say, that is founded just practically on the idea of, they were not Byzantines, they were Romans, and I know better, so I'm such a great appreciator of true Roman Empire culture, whatever. That I still call it Byzantine because I believe that the historiographical meaning of the term is actually dramatically deeper than any kind of simple thing like saying, yeah, they were Romans. Yeah, well, thanks my eyes. That's literally the first thing that you learn when you start studying, a Byzantine history manual. But we still call it Byzantine. And even, the greatest experts in the world, they don't call themselves Romanists. They call themselves Byzantinists. And there is a specific reason why they keep doing that. And I think it's an important reason. A reason that I've kept highlighting over and over again on this channel. But as you know, I've been doing a consistent amount of Byzantine history content here, so it's not that I'm an expert. At university, every time I could pick a Byzantine history class, I would, because I thought it was really important, as I still do. But say the more I went on with the overall thing, that is not just the fixation with the Byzantines, but looking a bit at all of Europe in its entirety, what was going on, you start to feel the necessity at that point of differentiating in a way. First of all, reevaluating what the Franks, the Saxons, did with the empire. They also called themselves Romans, by the way, from Ottonian times onwards at least. And there was a real Romanity in the nature of the Western Empire. And that's something, again, that I made lots of videos about under the name of Renovatio Imperii, and I will have to discuss again, because it's again one of those topics that, exactly because of the Byzantine meme, have been so brutally diminished, but properly nobody has ever really spoken about those. If somebody says, the Holy Roman Empire had as many reasons to be a Roman Empire than the one of Constantinople, everybody thinks that as a sort of revanchism and this primitive, Latin-Germanic brutes that we are for some kind of nationalistic. Really, it's not really the case, right? It's a much deeper question that encompasses basically any possible field of medieval history, and that is much more important than it seems, and much closer properly to the military religious concept of the empire that the actual Romans believed in at the beginning. Constantinople was something else, right? It was indeed the enormous continuator of the Roman legacy, and it was Roman in itself, but it was not the only thing that existed, and things change, right? In fact, the reason why the Byzantine Empire has become so easily a meme is because it is founded on a sclerotic, at least the meme is founded on a sclerotic understanding of its own identity. You just learn those three things by heart, and you think Byzantine history. Is not really like that. Whereas the others have seen as some kind of degeneration from Roman. It's a very complex thing. I made 2 videos on the concept of Byzantine, which is really a symbological trap, at least of what we have made of it, right? And not just because we call them Byzantines instead of Romans, right? But for much deeper and kind of, crudely Freudian reasons that you don't want to know. In any case, but I will tell you anyway at some point. Because there are unresolved problems. It's not a Freudian thing. It's more like a Jungian one, actually. It's the principle of individuation and what the mess that we have done back then that we still haven't solved, and that's the reason why we hate ourselves still to this day, because we haven't taken it, and everything that happens just is a eternal re-expansion of the problem that will crush us ultimately. There is much of Indo-European religion in that concept as well, not surprisingly, by the way, because of the twilight of the gods and because the world ages and all this stuff. In any case, that's the other thing. But what I was saying about the Byzantine Empire is that we have made of it essentially this idea of a bulwark that stopped a likely either Islamization of Europe or something like this. Now, this is absolutely true. I mean, I am one of those people that believes. I mean, it's not absolutely, and it's not true, right? But yes, it's correct to stress that the siege of Constantinople 717 was way more important in terms of potential consequences than the Battle of Poitiers. That also was not really a skirmish. It was a really important thing, and who tries to diminish that it also has a problem. But indeed, the fall of Constantinople in the hands of the Muslims would have been a much more radically impacting event, right? And even without the Islamization of Europe, which was very far from likely, the same goes for Poitiers, let's say. But the question being rather, there is a misunderstanding also who were the Muslims, right? It was not outside of the wall of the gates of Constantinople, an exterminated mass of people who were radical Islamic fundamentalists everywhere. No, Constantinople under Arab siege was in fact besieged by a Christian fleet, because that's what the Arabs had with them. And the same Byzantine one, as a matter of fact, of the ports of Egypt, of Palestine, of Syria, that had opened the gates to the Arabs back in the day because they hated Constantinople's guts, right? And so also, Spain. I mean, the subjects were Christian, right? It's not the people were Muslim there. So this another concept. But aside from that, and so of the obvious political intersections and culturally speaking, etc. I mean, think about the iconoclasm, right? And these kind of weird madnesses that, in fact, just Constantinople did, because Western Christendom in itself may have invented the papal monarchy in the 11th century, but it never went astray with heresies that were winking at, monothelitism, monophysitism, destroying the icon. I mean, the West was quite orderly. That said, it was simpler, no doubt, but more primitive. But it still did, and relatively so, by the way, because that's also the crucial problem that is often not discussed. There wasn't really a dark age, right? And Latin-Germanic Europe was dramatically advanced in many ways already at the time. But the idea is that, if there hadn't, the Byzantines passed like the heroes, like that stopped everything, while the rest of Europe was just a bunch of, retarded apes doing nothing. Right, that's the message that sometimes passes, like, I think. Obviously, it wasn't like that. Not just because you can't have, like, a Carolingian Empire, right, and eventually the foundation or the continuation of a potential that eventually overwhelmed the same Constantinople in some centuries. Like, that's another thing. But in general, because of the role that Constantinople really had in terms of the invasions. First of all, of course, Constantinople was defending itself, and it's fine, right? You can't really blame them for saying, yes, by defending themselves, like the Franks were defending Aquitaine. Actually, the Franks didn't even give a damn about Aquitaine. They were just taking it over, right? But they didn't want the Arabs to be there as well. They scored that hit for the benefit of the rest of Europe. There is no doubt about this. But at the same time, exactly because we have stressed mostly the Europeanness in a strictly racialistic sense as a criterion there to defend. I mean, why all this hype for Constantinople? Nobody really knows much about Byzantine history, but it's the thing, they were fighting against the Muslim, hence they were the heroes of the situation in the kind of alt-right perspective of how mostly history and alleged tradition, at least in the heads of those people, is supposed to be. But in that sense, whatever was, again, the Vikings were cool, right? Or the Slavs were cool in terms of, at least they were white, right? What was at stake at the time, actually, was something dramatically more important, that the West had and succeeded in, and this is the interesting aspect of the story, in protecting, nurturing, and re-expanding against the pressure of these peoples. It's not fair to say that the second invasions were overrated per se. These were really bloody invasions that threatened to cripple significantly, in much worse ways than they did, the Western development. And there was a very sharp divide, actually, between what was more like a civilized reality and what was like more like of a barbarian one, right? When you look at Anglo-Saxon England, I mean, there is hardly any doubt that the English were kind of already more advanced and civilized than the Scandinavians. I mean, they weren't light years ahead in the paths of civilizational development, but still there was kind of a public authority coordination, a sense of statehood emerging. There was a written tradition and permanent infrastructure and ecclesiastical administration. I mean, something that really was the base of much of what also England would develop further, even after being, in fact, affected by the Scandinavian invasions. That were, positive in their own way, in the sense that, of course, they were acting at the detriment of other systems, but for Scandinavia were also a mean of development at the same time. The Viking Europe starts with essentially a bunch of war bands, uncoordinated war bands taking the sea, raiding and pillaging as average pirates, to to actual quasi-feudal kingdoms established, right? In reality, where before it was just tribesmen, right? So war, as always, is a dramatic civilizational booster for many reasons. If anything, because it reactivates the moral forces that are put under dramatic pressure. And in fact, the only point being that, of course, war can also, however, destroy completely a civilization. So this did happen in many circumstances. What we see in medieval Europe in these centuries is definitely that what had been post-Roman Europe essentially was still the most advanced, was still the one that, in spite of all the destructions, the contraction, the decline, had starting reemerging from those centers, because, you know, where should have this happened from objectively? Again, looking at early medieval times is kind of a dark age, and very often even there still the Anglo-Saxon perspective is often the thing, because of course Britain was, you know, some of the least developed areas in post-Roman Europe, and so the impression is, yeah, there the dark ages happen, also because they are, you know, poorly documented and so on. But in Gaul it wasn't like that, in Italy it wasn't like that, in Spain it wasn't like that, not even in certain areas of Germany. That there was, especially here, the continuity in an idea of empire that in a public sense, in forms of military organization and all what that concerns, is an enormously powerful glue for further civilizational boosting, right? And it's obvious that at the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, Europe was exposed now to the surrounding peoples that didn't have much else, let's say, in terms of their own possibilities, but looting other countries in order to develop further. That was a real necessity for them, because again, do you want to, you know, what is more convenient, to invest in the 8th century Scandinavian hinterland, or, you know, going to loot overseas places like, where there are fatly rich monasteries where there is a bigger market, when there are, you know, bigger political games. You know, I think the latter is the answer. The same is valid for the Magyars coming from the steppes. In a way, also for the pirates of the North African coasts that, again, were not entirely just, in fact, states, and that would permeate the coast, but as a consequence, not really ever establishing a real power, right? Sicily was the product of the Tunisian state invasion, not of scattered kind of war bands of Saracens. The same Caliphate of Cordoba was a real state. It posed real threats. It could support these pirates, by the way, but wouldn't wage kind of an invasion of destruction. I don't know. They tried with the Gallic hinterland, but it was extremely difficult to maintain control at such a distance from the Al-Andalus, right? North Africa also by itself never had demographically, economically any chance in terms of, competition with the northern shores of the Mediterranean, ever, right? They might have had some trade potential. I mean, think about the time of Carthage, but famously enough, they had just trade emporiums. They didn't have a demographic push like the Greeks or the Italics. So, of course, we have also depicted this era in the sense, these were the guys who could keep. Also, we could check the Post-Carolingian powers. We could put them under their control at risk. Probably the most successful, telling the truth, were the Magyars, because the Magyars were quite of a, the steppes do produce extremely tough political bodies per se. Of course, they undergo disruption, contraction, etc. But these were the next people that succeeded to establish in the Carpathian Basin and to launch from there across areas that were either, they weren't generally permeable because they didn't have like a political unity at that point, like Germany and Italy especially, but they raided up to Gaul. It was also chronically fragmented, even up to Spain, right? They didn't attack the Byzantine Empire, if not after Lechfeld, when they were forced temporarily to search for another place to loot, just out of habit, but they saw it was too much, and so they decided to settle down definitely and to start building a state alongside essentially the Frankish pattern. Now, the nature of, especially of the Magyar raids in Germany, is something big, because it didn't just entail the Hungars per se, but all the Western Slavic populations that were joining the Magyar raids into Germany. Germany suffered in there of a political divide, right? Probably, and as Otto I showed, with a political compaction, the Eastern Frankish kingdom had the means to block for good at that point the Magyar raids. The point was having that political compaction that naturally in the most backwards of the Post-Carolingian kingdoms was more difficult to attain, but the Magyars still kind of also contributed to nurture because of the metus hostilis. And that was a big risk, meaning that all the eastern provinces of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, so mostly Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria, they were really at risk of being destroyed politically, institutionally, by the Magyar raids. Were quite hard, they hit quite ferociously, and were methodically persistent simply because there was no authority that there could stop them in the moment of greatest fragmentation of the empire. And more, actually, because when we look at the Byzantine Empire, we do see that there was a protection in a resistance provided by the civil spread of the Byzantine Empire, right? This was evident already in Carolingian times, as essentially the Byzantine Empire reactivated just as the West reactivated. I mean, the same is valid also for the Muslim world. There were similar, let's say, trends in many ways at this point. And it is true that especially the Byzantine Empire, however, was more solid, or was more solid of a power than Latin-Germanic Europe in post-Carolingian times, because again the latter completely fragmented, whereas the Byzantine Empire remained compact, right, and did have a capacity of stemming, indeed, especially the Muslim element. As we're talking about yesterday, for example, with the Byzantine missions among the Slavs, the Bulgars, the Varangians, we definitely see Constantinople as a pole of attraction. That was a dangerous one, because initially all these peoples were somewhat enemy of the empire, right? They were external elements that the empire had to cope with. Especially with these ones, I mean, the Bulgars, yes, they came from the steppes, but they effectively were still kind of this operating and blending in ultimately with the Slavic population that had been there in the Balkans now for a while. The Slavs, Edom, they were still Europeans. Indeed, in this sense, that did make a difference, because even the Norse, the Varangians, I mean, these were all peoples that had known what the empire was, what a more stable way of life was, etc. This is important, because it's like, drawing the differences with during the earlier migration era, when you say, I don't know, between the Germans and the Huns, definitely the Germans were already kind of Romanized, even if those who had lived outside of what we consider the borders of the Roman Empire, whereas the Huns were literally, the the monsters coming from hell, right? So they didn't have properly the cultural tools and capacities to establish like a permanent sedentary, domination. It was impossible for them. So there was a capacity during the second invasions to definitely have a dialogue by a certain degree, as we will see now, because you couldn't just cope with them with the sword in general, right? They had interests, and these interests definitely didn't include to make war all the time, even though they kind of did, right? But the elites were extremely sensible to say, okay, let's become more powerful, let's give more stability to our population so that we can interact with these greater powers and, benefit without having to live literally, on horseback all the time, like a Bulgar, 7th century Bulgar horseman, that you're surely not more, intelligent or capable than, but that surely would cause a lot of damage to a more, advanced reality without, seeing immediately at least the benefits of. And it was a great struggle. I mean, these things went on for centuries. If you look at the wars between the Bulgars and the Byzantines, up to Basil II, even beyond, right? That thing kind of never stopped. Like that war was always the frontier in a way or another. And indeed, the Byzantines stopped the Muslim East from penetrating in the Balkans, pushing further in southern Europe. Also, it was able to stem new hordes of Turks that were, descending at that time from the regions of the Volga up to the lower Danube, right? But if you just look at the map and you look at the second invaders from a Latin-Germanic perspective, you realize that Constantinople, as big as it was and as powerful as it was, didn't really actually cover directly the borders of the Latin-Germanic world. It did not, right? The big mental trick here saying, again, the Byzantines were the only bulwark between Europe and the Muslims. But is Europe and the Muslims, like by the early and high Middle Ages, like an accurate dichotomy of what reality was, even just politically speaking? I mean, what about those Europeans like Slavs or Vikings that were kind of pushing furiously and violently at the gates of Germany and of France? The same Saracens of the Western Mediterranean. Well, yes, there was some Byzantine involvement in southern Italy that initially contained and also recovered at some point some territories from the Saracens. But no, I mean, if you look at, Fraxinetum, the Saracen base in Provence, and the other raids in central, not just in southern, but also in central in northern Italy. As we were saying before, some Saracens from across the Alps went into the Rhineland as well. So did Constantinople have anything to do with that? Really not. And there would be more to say also in the broader relation of the inhabit of the locals, because the locals, again, were not just frightful rabbits that these pirates arrived and looted and raped and and then when this poor Europe abandoned from everybody this absolutely not. Actually, as we've seen, the Saracens were actually in most cases just like the Vikings, mercenaries that were hired by the local powers to send them one against the others. This is particularly evident in Gaul, for example, with the Vikings, as in southern Italy with the Saracens. Of course, a lot of action would be taken autonomously as well, so they were not a positive force altogether. They weren't just about the locals. But the locals, again, as we were saying before, had much greater potential of these people than these peoples. And the reasons they stare apparently under is that in those moments they actually were interested, especially because of their political fragmentation, to maybe use these alliances more fluidly, right, than just the dichotomic opposition. But unfortunately, again, we have matured this thing. Interestingly enough, this thing of the Saracens, the Turks, whatever, that was, it didn't exist. Yes, we see that whichever invader came would put the situation in distress, but the myth of, let's say, this dramatic impact of, I don't know, the Saracens in the Mediterranean, whatever, I mean, in the north, in the Christian countries, etc., is more like it starts emerging historiographically only from the Renaissance onwards. You know, when the Ottomans came on the scene. At that point, European historians began to say, look, what is happening now with the Ottomans, the Ottoman periods, and whatever, that even in there was an extremely shaded and complex thing. There were many Muslim, allies of the Christians against the Ottomans, just for example. And there were many Christian fighting for the Ottomans, of course, as always. But that's another issue. The issue is that historians began to tell that the Saracens back in the High Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, had done essentially what the Ottomans were doing at the time. Well, they weren't really far from reality. I mean, of course, they did. They were pirates. They weren't really doing much more, let's say. But the degree of impact, psychologically speaking, and of terror and depression that was connected to these second invasions back in the High Middle Ages has been kind of overly inflated on the basis of what instead we can register from, for example, those same regions that were next door in, I don't know, for example, in the same Italian peninsula, to the areas that were hit by the raids, and that where we don't find actually anybody complaining about anything. Or maybe they were complaining about something else. Mostly the wars that were occurring within the same Christians at the same time. Of which, as we've seen, the Saracens also became kind of a tool, right? In other words, there would have not been those footholds like in Bari or Taranto, like in southern Italy, if it hadn't been mostly the Longobards kind of clashing against one another, right? Or even with the Byzantines or the Franks in between. And the same can be said, for example, for southern France. I mean, why did Fraxinetum last for such a long time? Big games, for example, the alliance, like the cooperation, let's say better, between the Ottonians and the Cordobans, that for a while, like for not really, with the Italian policy of the Ottonians and the general, Western Mediterranean one of the Cordobans, was, kept things where they were like a sort of repartition of spheres of influence more than else. For not talking about the provincial cities in southern Gaul, the Christian ones that preferred actually to have the Saracens next door, especially considering that they were connected to a market that was essentially the caliphal one that stretched from, in fact, the Atlantic to Southeast Asia, that had all to benefit from the degree of economical dynamism, than being brought under the northern Franks that were, at that time not really capable of intervening, but still, some local powers connected to them would like to centralize further in those areas. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom was really there. Yes, it was kind of maybe the one that suffered most. It kind of got Scandinavized by a certain degree. And it kind of crumbled, perhaps exactly because of that reason, actually, because the Viking era did bring a lot of privatization further, but still, the Kingdom of England was that, and even the Normans that were settled in France were not really Vikings when they conquered England. They were Western Franks, right? So it's still the Frankish world that takes over, as you know, at the end of the day. And the same can be said for Germany. This place was the least obvious from which, anything could rise, and instead, exactly probably because of the level of militarization of the population, this kind of non-existing eastern frontier, because Germany objectively doesn't have anything like an eastern border. Historically, had always maintained its populations kind of more warlike, more kind of capable just of seeing themselves as the ones who would take arms at some point, recoalizing according to the elective models that were part of the tribal past would remain even in the Holy Roman Empire, and not just cutting the Magyar invasions, but also doing a little thing called like the Renovazione Imperium, right? And going to Rome to be crowned emperors and controlling Italy, connecting it to the to Germany and the empire for good, basically. So when we look especially at the Eastern push in Central Europe from, in fact, the steppes, and even just as a domino effect on, for example, on the Slavs in the process, we realize that the Latin-Germanic world was actually undergoing a lot of stress. I mean, even the same Bulgars that were mostly unavoidably attracted to Constantinople, as most of the Slavs there, because not just it was the most powerful place, but in this sense, those who could even build an empire to threaten it, like the Bulgars could hope to take it over, just like the Arabs were trying to do from the other side, were actually knocking at the Eastern Frankish doors. The Slavs, we've seen that this great thing of the Great Moravia, then later on with the Magyar invasion, the participation of the Western Slavs to the raids in Germany, also the Slavization, what had been normally Germanic lands. I mean, think about east of the Elbe, right? Traditionally, in the ancient times, the Germans had inhabited far of those lands. In the migration era, lots had left, and so the Slavs arrived. But also, these Slavic tribes were pretty kind of aggressive, right? And pretty warlike, and pretty resilient, and uncooperative. And the main problem for the Germans at that point is that they couldn't even invade them and claim any kind of victory, because there was effectively not like a urbanized society, for example. The Slavs were fanatic defenders, and pretty damn good ones, and they defeated the Germans on multiple occasions. And so this is extremely relevant, because aside from Bohemia, that was kind of more obviously to enter within the orbit of the Frankish Empire, and generally speaking was closer to civilization, in fact was the most developed of the Western Slavic countries. In many ways it was more compact, also there were some advantages, etc. Like the Germans didn't make it to, I don't know, annexate Poland to there, and made actually a lot of they waged a lot of campaigns against the country, but they wouldn't manage to take it over. Well, in between, of course, there was a lot else. It was not just a German versus, Slavs things. In the process, the Slavs were being civilized, also because of all the missionary activities from St. Germany, but mostly it was an imperial grandeur that was being reactivated, right, with the Ottonians, with the papacy, with also properly the consolidation of the rest of the West. I mean, think about the rise of the Carpathians in France and the consolidation of that what would become effectively the cradle where most Western culture, in fact, would emanate from, and that the Post-Carolingian kingdoms kind of mostly, absorbed just because they were better predisposed. Post-Carolingian Europe had never died as a unity, paradoxically. Think about the monasteries, the script, the communication, the models of government. I mean, we're talking really about advanced realities that were dramatically intensifying their civilizational output. But the pressure of the Easterners, well, this fell evidently on Eastern Francia. And the Byzantine Empire could divert some forces coming from the east, especially from the steppes. But this was kind of a defense in depth, right? It was kind of an obstacle in front of which some forces were consumed or softened up. But let's say that the broader Central and Eastern European and beyond world was provided with a tendentially unlimited dynamism. I mean, you could literally never know what would arrive next from the steppe. Again, the world was aging and kind of maturing, and even the same steppes were becoming kind of more stately in character, so there would be a stabilization. But hell, ask the Poles and the Germans that had to face the Mongols at Lenitsa, still in the 13th century, right? So these things would literally never stop. And all that thing that I was saying before about how much we have forgotten the central, just even then more simply the Eastern European reality, is how radically intense the destabilizing factors were, and how pressuring the Eastern pushes were on these peoples. We made videos, for example, on the Polish army in the early period, like in the 11th century. You discovered that the Slavs there had 1/3 of their armies mounted. I don't know if you realize what this means. That is to say, in Western Europe, of course, there was, heavy cavalry developed. So, let's say cavalry was important for everybody, and probably these military systems were kind of balanced in those ratios. But you know that in the West, there were actually much more infantry men on average than 1 to 3. I mean, cavalry to infantry, right? That was obvious, if anything, because the same heavy cavalry required so many field aids, etc., that these troops also would fight in battle. If a Polish army in the 11th century had 1/3 of its elements mounted on a regular basis, you can immediately imagine the proclivity just of these peoples to leave on the right, right? I'm not saying that the Polans were initially, nomadic, but the idea that they would border nomadic peoples, and that these peoples would keep pushing and intervening and pressuring. I mean, I think, again, even just all the peoples that always were present at their borders, at the borders of Hungary, the borders of Poland, the borders of Russia, the Pechenegs, the Kumans. There was, earlier on, as we've seen yesterday, also the Khazars, etc. So those were not easy worlds, right? The strategic projection capacities of the steppes peoples were dramatic. I mean, you could have armies marauding. I mean, look at the Magyars themselves. I mean, they could raid as far as Spain, as southern Italy, northern Gaul, right? It was mostly Germany, but I mean, if they wanted, they could just go. And so this tells you also about their know-how, their capacity. By the way, these peoples were not like brutes. They had advanced siege warfare. They had a dramatic Middle Eastern influence that had matured during their migration, passing north of Persia. And they had absorbed much of those military cultures. They weren't just about the steppe. They were also about storming citadels and things like these. Yes, generally speaking, they maintained kind of the bias of the nomadic horse raiders that weren't really about all that siege, because warfare, because in the steppes there is much less of that. But in general, if anything, they were already more developed, and they kept developing further. And the lifestyle was also connected to the land. The Pannonian Plains are the westernmost Eurasian, part of the Eurasian steppes. East of the Carpathians, it's the steppes, it's the wildlands. East of the Dniester, where there's a war going on, that's the steppe. And also, again, the same people, the same sedentary ones, call it in this way, that leave. Think about the Baltics, the Slavs. These are pretty warlike peoples, tribes, clans, unstable, right? Just look at how difficult it was to stabilize Poland historically over the High Middle Ages, or other kings. I mean, it was really complicated to put together. Even look at the same Hungary. They were lucky because they had an imperial power and a potential that would mostly, make them afford to leave also of the subjugation of other peoples all around. But those are kingdoms that, even when they managed to westernize solidly and to have a solid royal power, at the end of the day, they will turn into elective monarchies, because it's always the oligarchy that rules and not really a central power, like in what would become Western Europe. In fact, Post-Carolingian Europe had the seeds of which had already been planted in many ways. So This was a wild I mean, think even about the Baltic, Scandinavia. We say 1066, Harald Hardrada dies at Stamford Bridge. Also, Harold Godwinson is killed at Hastings. The Viking era ends. The Viking era didn't actually end at all, right? Aside from the fact that it was slavery in Finland up to the 17th century, but the simple fact that, it was normal for a Norwegian, a Swedish, a Danish ruler to just take the ships, and now they stopped essentially turning them west because the Western countries kind of consolidated more. They kept doing the same exact thing in the Baltic for centuries, and in much more ferocious and better, because they were more effective, right? They were starting to be kind of even feudal monarchies and centralized, but we're talking about wild realities. Again, today we are used to see them as beacons of civilization, but after a few hundred years ago, this is still the wildest areas in Europe, and in part this was even an advantage to a certain degree of civilizational development, because they rose quickly in times where they had models to import from the most advanced countries where there wasn't really much before in their own land, so they updated quicker in a way. They got the newer civilization instead of putting patches on kind of the older one like some of the other countries. So this part was extremely brutal. Just some week ago, because it was asked, I made that review about Pinker's. I don't even remember what's the name of the book that argued that today we make less wars than before, that we're less violent than before. At least we just because of the conditions in which we live, we're less habituated to violence. That is and therefore less able to perform it in intelligent and effective ways. I'm absolutely convinced of that, even though maybe Pinker is not the best thinker around this stuff. But the idea of violence is not that it's bad in itself; it's that you should know how to wage it. Otherwise, you don't know even how to react or cope with it when you have to use it to somebody else's wages on you. A word like the Central European one in the High Middle Ages, it was a dramatically more brutal world than, say, I don't know, you pick Gaul or Italy, that were kind of more civilized places. There is no doubt about that. We see it. It's not that there wasn't war there, but it was a more orderly thing. There were more statally oriented structure, at least hierarchies that could control better the land. The majority of the population was kind of less was gradually disarmed. There was more kind of trade, there were more transactions, more people lived together, there was higher literacy. You pick Germany and you say, even later on, considering that even the Renovatio Imperii at the hands of the Ottonians or the German mercenaries and in the late Middle Ages, but why is that? Because these lands were dramatically more warlike. They were more habituated to have, I don't know, the Cuman raiders to pillage, I don't know, places like Austria or Moravia. It was just the reality. And it was also a much more fragmented reality politically, so you had to take matters in your own hands much more often than other places. That again, this doesn't mean that there were kind of the more belligerent places. Like the more belligerent places, normally the places that have more resources, right? I think Italy was easily the place where people made more war. They invested at least more resources in war. They made more war in absolute terms. But they did it in a more organized way. Whereas you pick Central Europe, it was kind of more like an existential condition of the individual, right? The mind had stopped a bit more to the tribal times. There were more kind of even mystical ethoses. I mean, think about the Minnesänger. Think about that kind of feudal culture for which the German knight surpasses even the French one in terms of fame, of aggressiveness, of this also offensivistic, tactical attitude, right, on the battlefield. Because, again, it was just like a more naturally violent world at an individual level. And again, this mostly derived because the central structures were looser, and so people took matters in their own hands more quickly. That's it. That's why you can say why a mobster is more violent than somebody living in a more civilized context, because the mobster normally kills people, right? And it's already predisposed with that mindset, and so it's easier to say if you have to send somebody in a firefight to rely on the mobster and rely on the more civilized guy, even though the structures, the community where he lives in is more capable and potentially even more destructive than the one of the mobster. And that's the reason why, the Frankish model, the Latin-Germanic world took over even, again, in fact, the Norse, the Magyars, etc. Because at the end of the day, civilization is something more than just beating each other. You have to understand it's more profitable to cooperate, not to wage war all the time. So, or at least to wage war, not just because you resort to war, but waging less war in relative terms, right? Of course, war has to be waged sometimes, and again, one should know actually how to use it. But again, it's difficult. You see, we're witnessing it with Russia today. Russia is evidently a less developed country. Culturally, properly, socioeconomic, it's really not really a great place to live. These people, for them, it's more normal to just carry out a massacre, just normally, or to just go at war and say, okay, let's support it because we are right. Than what a Westerner would do. Say, but Westerners also do make wars. Yeah, but if you consider the Western potential. If the West wanted to make war, we could destroy the entire world in theory. Whereas, and it doesn't do it. It may be extremely devastating when it does it in one single place. But here we have a country like Russia that is able to put at stake literally everything about its own future of a developed country or a world power. Just sending in and having seen 1/4 of its combat power wiped out in a war against, by the way, what one single country. I mean, that's the kind of attitude, right? And again, they don't know with the difference. They don't know to make war, because differently from the German mercenary of the 14th century that really made war on a regular basis. Also, the Russians, like most of the modern people, are just a bunch of slobs that have no idea, fortunately for them, what it means even to fight a war, to have a strategic culture. In the 13th century, instead, they understood that for real, because it was so habitual that it was just like obviously and readily evident what it consisted of, and especially from a moral point of view. So in many ways, this aspect probably highlights in a way that it's not been given enough credit before, especially to the Eastern Frankish role in the defense of probably Western Christendom altogether. It's absolutely fair to say, historically, that the immediate borders of Western Christendom had to be defended by Western Christendom itself, right? That the Byzantines, in that sense, didn't do much. And again, we get this distortion, this perspective distortion, by thinking that the only problem there were the Muslims, where the problem of civilization this time were the Normans, were the Magyars, were also some Slavs. Again, not because we should say those should be the enemies of the West. I mean, it was more than 1,000 years ago. It's not. We know that fortunately things improved, but yeah, in terms of who had to preserve a kind of a more civilized order, etc., these forces were kind of more detrimental. And again, it's kind of normal. I mean, all the studies that are, that look at the second invasions, they tell us that there wasn't really, that there is not, first of all, and this is absolutely correct, historically, no evidence whatsoever that was any broader ideological, political, strategical game behind these things. again, the Carolingian Empire had collapsed. These peoples from the outskirts who were just waiting for devouring the carcass launched themselves on them. And as soon as, again, the post-Carolingian powers recompacted themselves, they became obedient. The Vikings went away from Gaul, largely. They hit it very hard in the 9th and the 10th century, but then it kind of stopped. They mostly, even there, they didn't really stop anywhere. The Normans in the lower Seine Valley were settled with the permission of the king, and they became Franks. They mostly hit Britain, because the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was kind of smaller and had greater problems to stop it. They settled largely in the Danelaw, but even in there, they were eventually settled and civilized. The Magyars, after the Battle of the Lech, it's the same thing. They immediately stopped. Like, it's not that they tried it again. They said, oh, but let's come back to Germany to see it. No. Basically, they tried a bit against Constantinople, say maybe those guys are worse, and then they stopped. Definitely, for good. The Saracens in southern Italy, 915, the battle at the mouth of the Garigliano was an entrenched Saracen fort. The popes, the central Italians, the also some Byzantine help, others, they colonize, they wipe it out. The Saracens disappear from the area. Then the Normans would take matters in their own hands in Sicily, as you know. But the time of the great invasions were stopped. Actually, it was the Pisans and the Genoese that were sweeping the Western Mediterranean of Saracen Piracy at that point. And as we're pointing out in those videos talking about these things, you understand that you don't have, like, if this second invasions had been just like an atomic bomb that destroyed everything, there wouldn't be the magnificent military, naval traditions and engineering capacities of the Italian maritime republics. You wouldn't have the German imperial capacity to order the Central Europe under its own model, in spite of its own internal political subdivision, right? You wouldn't have France, after all the devastating raids, Viking raids, blossoming to the most powerful sum of principalities in Europe, just like that, even just in their cultural capacities as well. So it's really evident that was so much surviving and kind of taking its time, suffering, but also consolidating and eventually exploding and taking over. But again, the role of the Byzantine Empire in this, basically no, right? Even the same thing we were saying before in Italy, but yeah, they did something against the Saracens in the south, because they consider southern Italy like imperial possession still, but fundamentally, all that was properly the post-Carolingian kingdoms, the Italic kingdom, the Western Frankish kingdom, Eastern Frankish kingdom, they did it all alone. They stopped all those peoples alone. And what is overlooked, in my opinion, is the Eastern push. Because that was was more compact than we think. I mean, of the Saracens and of the Vikings, that at the end of the day were just kind of naval expeditions, right? They could be like larger armies, even of thousands, or even more. We don't know, but those are exceptions in Gaul and Italy. In Germany, it was different, because in Germany, you didn't have just the Magyars that were maybe the equivalent of this Viking or Saracen incursions, even just for the nature of their own armies, that were also powerful and probably better organized, because if anything, they operated more on a terrestrial base than the Saracens and the Vikings did. So strategically, yes, the Vikings and the Saracens were more like hit and run by a certain degree, whereas the Magyars had at least to wage the whole freaking campaign in the heart of Europe by land. The 10th century, you know what it means to cross hundreds of thousands of kilometers with an army in hostile territory. It's a freaking masterpiece. But the problem wasn't even them. The problem was as it had already been the case, for example, against the Byzantines from the Avars that were subjugating Slav, was the Slavic participation. Was the fact that these Slavs would activate alternatively, because they didn't like the Magyars as neighbors at all, right? They would never do, even later on. But they would be able to exploit the Magyar onslaught on Germany to raid in the same Germany. And this is something that the Germans themselves had done before. I mean, think about the Saxons against the Carolingians. You know, if for 200 years you just pillage the Rhineland continuously and the Franks come and tame you, exterminate some village and have to come back, and you keep repeating over and over and over again, you cannot complain if I invade Saxony and I deport its population, make large-scale massacres, and I carry out forced conversion, right? Because you have to cut it out. And it seems to work pretty well, because Saxony became the next imperial house. Right, so of the worst of all the Carolingian world, actually that's where the emperor, the next emperors would actually be. And partly, exactly, because maybe they had, you know, on their shoulders, not just imperial grandeur, but also that kind of repressed force of those people that would never back down, you know, in a way. But still, they did it without any pagan revival of anti-Frankish. No, they did it in the full wake of imperial legacy. And they were actually the ones who called it Roman. Like, the Franks were the Frankish Empire for them. The Ottonians, the Saxons, for them were the Roman Empire. It was a completely different, it was a big game changer. So, what is overlooked, in my opinion, again, is the oppression of the peoples transmigrating in the basins of the Danube, of the Oder, and of the Elbe. The Slavs, again, those are not very documented realities, right? By the 10th century, still the 11th century, these are largely obscure things. Like the sources are vague. They're just some ecclesiastical chronicles, not. But we understand that the blood that ran on that frontier was massive, and there isn't much of a difference between that and what we see, I don't know, a late Roman Germanic frontier, right? That was actually a pretty brutal business. Especially the Saxons, the Thuringians, the Bavarians had to really roll up their sleeves and began to beat as hard as they could, right? In the famous Battle of the Lechfeld, in fact, we tend to underestimate the fact that not just the Magyars had been defeated at Riada in 933, but that there was the Ottonian, that is Saxon propaganda that obscured the cadet branch of the Ottonians, the one of Bavaria, that actually, even there, it didn't have the big money of the Ottonian propaganda, but for the few hints and information that we get, we know that, well, first of all, they were the ones on the border with the Magyars, right? And they had already been, by the way, the descendants of the guys that had been on the border with the Avars, and even before, hell, with the Huns, right? There's such things in Germany. When I was saying about that habit to violence that the Germans had, well, that's exactly the same point, right? The Nibelungenlied was always actual, because, you know, the Burgundians versus the Huns could be like the Bavars against the Avars, and the Eastern Franks, in fact, the Bavarians against the Magyars. It was basically the same old story, and it would go on, right? Even if when Germany and Hungary were now stabilized as two kingdoms, like, so it was always same borders, right? These dynamics go on. The Bohemians against the Hungarians, the Germans. Think about the Battle of Markfeld, still in 1278. It was constant warfare in the same places. By the way, beautiful places, especially from a naturalistic point of view, but there is also a lot of medieval stuff left, were always the same. It would go on again in the modern age, the same frontier area, where a lot of blood always ran, and the same on the Elbe with the Slavs. and etc., etc. And again, the step is just next door, because the Pannonian Plain, Austria, is basically steppes, right? That's it, right? If you have you had there during the Bulgarian Empire, you had easily Bulgarian raiders arriving at the outskirts of Frankish territory, even riding into it, and vice versa. It happened all the time, since Carolingian times and before. Think about the Avar raids in Merovingian Germany, since, in fact, the 6th century. That's history. That was it was in the veins of those peoples, and especially those Slavs that were consolidating their power more politically, more strategically, like, as we were saying before, the Moravians, the Czechs, the Polands, etc. Well, all these countries would turn into something more compact later on. But again, how many expeditions did they have to launch from Saxony to beat these guys down? And again, these guys would always pop out again. They were terrifying, because again, yeah, you could go there, maybe even employ the resources to besiege those damn Slavic hill forts, and maybe storming them, exterminating people, burning them, skinning them alive, all these things. But then what? There were lots of other places scattered in the same way, in nightmarish grounds full of forests or swamps with no crop yield. And if like just they had this hungry and angry peoples that would just kind of burn yourself alive if they captured you in the same way. I mean, it was utterly terrifying. It's the same level of brutality that you find later on in the Baltic Crusades. It's the same thing. It's the same scenario. And the level of savagery that properly lived, again, within these peoples at the time, these are incredibly primitive and archaic times, is unspeakable. And again, this world theater has passed as unnoticed, saying, well, yeah, but, first of all, who cares about Central Eastern Europe here? I don't even see a defined kingdom, what it is, even about Germany or about Poland. It's all blurred, I don't understand. And then, well, yeah, they made wars. So why do you consider so much, for example, I don't know, the migration era as a pivotal moment of confrontation against between the Romans and the Germans, and this scenario is here between the Germans and the Slavs as well. Yeah, kind of, I don't know. It's terrifying. By the way, I think it's one of the most. I mean, I give that reason probably a dramatic amount of evidence to add much more historically to what we already know. Maybe something archaeological, but even just as a setting for popular culture entertainment, that's pretty cool in my opinion. Rather than just fixating on the Vikings because of the meme that we have made of them, we care about the Varangians because, again, the word Vikings plus, Russia, and so what some alt-writers consider the peak of ultra-conservatism, all these things. But what about, I don't know, Poland? Poland has an extraordinary history at that level, and the same Bohemia, the same Moravia, the same Hungary. I mean, these are dramatically underrated countries. And there is more. There is also the other chapter of for example, the Slavic piracy, or the Pomeranian piracy, that people just say, that's an important picture. We'll have to make a video about that, because they were an important actor in the Baltic. But even in there, do you really hear of them so much? Not really. And naturally, the Medes were not just called Ottonian steel, let's say, but also diplomacy, religious preaching, missions. We were seeing yesterday how important and brutal, even on that ground, the competition between Rome and Constantinople was for Christianizing their peoples in their own churches, and how brutal the local elites were to sometimes raise. Yesterday we were talking about Great Moravia, that first was converted by the Byzantines and then converted by the Catholics, and then with literal, we know archaeological, the destruction of the first churches at the hands of the sign that eventually replaced it with the Catholic one. And so all means of consolidation that responded to logics that are not just local or continental, but they're imperial in scale, universal in scale. I made a video. It's the duchy of the consolidation of the Peninsular Duchy in the 10th century. That's a video that talks about this and see how messed up actually the situation was. And in this broader picture, what you get is essentially the Latin-Germanic world enucleating itself ever more as a competitor to Constantinople. These were the same years when the Europeans were coming out of the second invasions, where the empire stood in all its magnificence. It doesn't matter that something weird that had happened, for which the empire was now namely this kind of German-Italian thing, and that France, that had been the cradle of the same Carolingian Empire, was kind of another thing that you didn't understand why it wasn't part of an empire, but in theory the empire was universal. I mean, whatever. But it still shows that the West was elephantiac, so much that you could have factually different things, including an entire empire that could pursue that universal policy, even in competition with the Byzantines, and not being the entire thing of the West, being there a lot more than that. And it was evident exactly in the capacity of repelling and defeating and putting an end to the second invasions, and kind of even expanding and overwhelming, from a cultural point of view, the same populations that had carried out these invasions, that the political and religious powers of the West were in dramatic competitions with the one of Constantinople, because they embodied a real power, a power that had managed, just as Constantinople, and actually more than that, in terms of expansive capacity, to tame, to keep at bay, to reduce the strength of these external pressures. And now the West was actually overflowing out of itself, even. Something that the Byzantine Empire wasn't really, at least in the same way. So, again, this also happened largely to also the framing of these populations within the ecclesiastical order that disciplined life. Right, this was done. If you wonder how Christianity here was back in this world at the same time, it was doing it for the sake of a hierarchy, of an order, of an authority. Much of Western Christianity, I will make a video soon, so in those ones of the Indo-European series, was actually making its own the older ideas of power and order. Christ was becoming the Lord, I mean the armed one. There was, in the spirit of these people, something exalting, glorious, was pointing towards the exaltation of the same heroes, the same fighters, right? Constantinople had something like this, but ideally that was more like of a power crystallized from the top, so much that the Basileus had maintained name titles like the one of autocrator and so on. They were kind of more like the one of the ancient Roman emperors in terms of heroism, etc., but at the same time had achieved this at the expense of the kind of subjugation of the masses, of the popular forces. In the West, these popular forces, again, they were being ordered, they were being guided, they were being used to expand, to declare, to fight, and with a force that objectively is not to be witnessed at this point, that were actually the great Byzantine and the great Caliphal culture are beginning to slow down, if anything, in comparison. Alright, we will keep talking about this topic. Hopefully, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.